A nation can survive its fools, and even the ambitious, but it cannot survive treason from within.
They've been wrong about the wars. They've been wrong about jobs. They've been wrong about everything. The question is, are they stupid or do they have a plan? I actually think for the most part, they have a plan, but some are not too smart.
Welcome to the Horrible Deplorable Show, the anti-globalist America First program dedicated to dehoaxing the media and destroying the narrative. Here's your host, the founder and editor of the Daily Stir, Matt Wingard.
Welcome to the Horrible Deplorable Show. My name is Matt Wingard, and with me as always is my good friend Doris. Hello, Doris.
Hello, Matt.
Want to welcome the Gab community and all of those from the Gab community who are listening. You can hear this show and previous episodes of this show on iTunes, SoundCloud, Stitcher, Pocket Cast. We play on the 405media.com on Saturday and Sundays on the weekends. If you want to write me specifically to ask me a question, a topic you'd like to hear covered on the podcast, you can do so at mattmwingard@gmail.com. It's mattmwingard@gmail.com. So Jeff Flake has announced that he will not be running for re-election. This is good news. It accelerates our timetable. We've been talking on this podcast about going after Heller, Flake, and Corker, and since we started talking about that, we've made some really significant gains. Bob Corker announced that he wouldn't run for re-election, and now Flake, clearly seeing the writing on the wall as far as his own polling in the state of Arizona, has decided that he won't even attempt to win his primary. I'm sure he was under pressure from NeverTrumpers to get out so that they can get one of these other congressmen or women in Arizona to run because they don't want Kelly Ward to win that primary. So Arizona is going to be a focal point, a hotspot, if you will, for this whole Never Trump, Make America Great Again, pro-Trump fight. It's going to be a battleground because John McCain's going to pass away in the next year or two, and his seat's going to have to be replaced. And Jeff Flake is clearly going to be replaced. That's now an open seat. So there's a chance to go from two Never-Trumpers to two pro-Trumpers in a very short period of time in the state of Arizona. And I think what you'll see is that a lot of money from both sides is going to flow into that because everybody's going to see it as a test case for other places. So we'll keep our eye on who is going to step in to challenge Kelly Ward. I do not believe that she's going to get a free pass in that primary. More to come. Bannon has already announced that he's going to have an opponent against every single Republican running in the Senate this year except for Ted Cruz. We're still waiting for the names and everyone to get announced on that. I will say that I believe John McCain is the primary person responsible for Jeff Flake's demise. So, as always, John McCain's a good friend to John McCain, but he ran a campaign in which he made a lot of promises that he had no intention of fulfilling, barely squeaked by in a extremely close primary race in the last cycle, and then won the general election, and then proceeded to betray all of that and go back to being the low-down, dirty politician that he is. And I think, he can't run for re-election. He won't anyway, because like I said, he's going to pass away. But he's not accessible to the voters for 6 more years. But they could certainly take out their frustrations on Jeff Flake, who has married himself to John McCain's politics, and therefore he just becomes a focal point for the whole Never Trump movement. So I would say that John McCain's vote against Obamacare repeal and all of that, the first real casualty of all of that is his friend Jeff Flake, and there are going to be others. The NeverTrumpers are not going to win this battle. So apparently the super PAC aligned with Mitch McConnell has decided they're just going to declare open war on Bannon. This article that I read says that they want to challenge him directly in these primary fights. They're going to try to paint him as a white nationalist and discredit him, which is an interesting tactic for them to take. They're going to spend millions of dollars on this. It's not going to work in Republican primaries, and it's going to backfire, and it's just going to further highlight that they're not on board the Trump train and going to distance them from voters because they haven't produced any results in Congress. So they already look weak. Then they attack Bannon with what is clearly a scurrilous charge that he's a white nationalist. That kind of thing is, maybe a more effective tactic in a general election, but in the primary, it's just going to tick off Republican voters and drive them to Bannon's candidates. So it looks like Custer's last stand to me when I read this article. They're looking to double and triple down instead of trying to find a way to compromise. And even if they don't exactly like all of Trump's national agenda, you meet him halfway and you try to find a way to live with as much as you can to survive. But what's going to further infuriate Republican voters is look at how McConnell and his Never Trump people are willing to drive a stake in the ground on this issue, right? On fighting off Trump and the nationalist Make America Great movement. That's what they're willing to sacrifice their careers for, right? They like us to think that, well, they're all just politicians, so they're all snakes and they move with the currents. And that's why they don't drive the stake in the ground and fight till the last dog dies against Democrats. But here they are given an opportunity to be politicians and to accept the wave that is coming and to reorient themselves as they tell us that's what politicians do in this sort of cynical way. And yet here they won't do it. Here they're going to make Custer's last stand. They're going to say, no, I would rather get defeated and have my political career ended than agree with Trump. Now, they were never willing to do this during the Obama administration, right? They were never willing to drive the stake in the ground and say, absolutely not, we're not going there. We will do everything we can to defeat this guy. We're going to move impeachment articles if we have to, and if that means the voters turn against us, so be it. No, they never felt that anything Obama did was an impeachable offense, but they constantly allow this whisper campaign about impeaching Trump to stay alive. So it's all the information that you need, that these people are not incompetent, that what we've been watching for the last few years, the last decade or so, is not Republicans who can't somehow figure out how to defeat Democrats, that they're just not as good at the political game as Democrats. No, it is very clear they are the Washington Generals, paid to take a dive. They understand their role when they get to D.C. is to put up a good fight, a good show, and then fall in the 7th round because there's a lot of money on this fight, if you get that reference.
Continuing trying to ruin the Republican Party.
Yeah, essentially the message is and this is somewhat the neocons, and then it's also the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and the Open Borders folks, but basically saying, look, if this party isn't going to be for open borders and for continuous war everywhere on the planet, then we don't want to have anything to do with it. If it's going to be about protecting American jobs and protecting America's manufacturing base and fighting for the white working class and for essentially telling the truth about all this identity politics that's going on and maybe having to be a little rude about it. Well, just count us out, they say in a huff. It's really despicable. I mean, now we know who the real deplorables are in this scenario. But it's been an eye-opener for me as somebody who's served in my state legislature and who has been on kind of a slow red pill when it comes to the Republican Party. Look, my eyes got opened very wide over the whole Trump campaign, and I saw everybody that I once sort of gave the benefit of the doubt to or made excuses for. I saw them all for who they were. So I can't honestly say at this point that I'm surprised, but it is just astounding that they were never, ever fighting for us. This was always a rigged game, and it's a uniparty. It's an absolute uniparty. They may not necessarily agree on social issues, but the people we've been electing to fight for conservative causes either, and it's a combination of two things, either don't actually believe in all of those things, or They believe in them, but they are in politics for themselves. They have a defeatist attitude. They believe that the tide of history is against them and the Democrats are going to win, and so they're just in it for what they can get. The salary, the benefits, the nice lifestyle, and they, of course, love going to all of the conservative meetings around the country and being praised for being a fighter and a champion. They love it when conservatives come up to them and hand them a $50 check and say, "I'm so happy that you're there fighting for us, and thank you for your speech tonight. The rubber chicken was great," but they actually had no intention of doing anything. That's the bad news, and a lot of people have to go. We're going to get to that list a little bit later, but I want to move on to the Russian dossier story. So after all of the fake news and the liberal commanding heights and the Democrats all deciding they're going to concoct this Russia influenced the election and Russia has some nefarious influence with Trump, this whole bogus Barbra Streisand story that has been going on for months and that they knew had been weakening. Now, finally, because apparently some lawsuit is going to force this truth out, the Clinton people have come out and admitted that they and the DNC were the people who originally paid for this dirt to be made. Now, they're trying to point that this all started with a Republican. That will probably turn out to be the Bushes that were involved early on in paying for opposition research or dirt on Trump. But let's be very clear about the timeline. It wasn't until that had been passed off to the DNC and Hillary Clinton, and they were then paying for it, that Mr. Steele, the MI6 agent or former MI6 agent in the UK, was brought on board, and this phony dossier was created. That was created under the Hillary Clinton and DNC portion of this dirt campaign. And so, of course, now the mainstream media is discounting the whole thing and saying, well, yeah, everybody digs up dirt on everybody else. So when Donald Trump Jr. was taking a meeting because he was offered, he thought, dirt on Clinton, this was absolute evidence of a Russia connection and collusion. But 2 months later, when it comes out that the dossier, which is the central document in this whole thing that's driven all of this Russian collusion BS, and which is entirely false. It contains no actual truthful information. When it turns out that that was a smear campaign paid for by Hillary Clinton and the DNC, yeah, there's no Russian collusion. Now, you know the whole thing is a lie and that it's just a political weapon when there's just this avalanche of information around Uranium One and that whole deal, and Clinton, Bill Clinton receiving a $500,000 check, and now we find out the FBI was investigating all sorts of bribery that was going on around that deal, but now they're claiming that Clinton, the Secretary Clinton, never knew about that stuff, and therefore the committee that signs off on these deals didn't know. Yeah, okay. First of all, I don't believe any of that. But even if it was true, there you have 5 or 6 points of Russian collusion that are literally 1 degree separated from Secretary Clinton. And is the press going crazy with stories about how the woman who was going to be president of the United States was, heavily connected to the Russians? No, they've got nothing but excuses on all of that. And they're giving it either no attention on the national news or a few seconds, and they're moving on as if nothing to see here. And yet they take meeting with a Russian ambassador, or the fact that he runs into him at a cocktail party, and they make that a week's worth of Russian collusion stories. It's all phony. And the press has also exposed themselves as complete and utter tools of the left wing in this country. It's, again, another example of what I've described in a previous podcast as this 180 degree tactics, right? 180 degree tactics. That they're for blue today, and then tomorrow, if they need to be against blue, they'll just flip, and they don't have any shame about it. And, it reminds me, and of course it's the same people, back during the heyday of the communist movement when the Russians were running the Comintern and they had heavily penetrated Hollywood and Washington, D.C., and the Roosevelt administration, they used to just, they had all these communist front organizations that were anti-war or were pro-Russia, or they had all sorts of mission statements, but no one knew that they were actually getting funding from the Comintern, and that basically the one thing they all did was always take a pro-Soviet line. And there were lots and lots of groups like this that existed around Europe and in the United States. And it's now a joke for those who know a little bit of history that when, a lot of these groups were anti-Hitler, and they would make public demonstrations in Times Square or whatever and be against Hitler. And then Hitler and Stalin signed the Non-Aggression Pact in 1939, I believe. And then immediately all of those groups were pro-Hitler. Like the next day they were doing pro-Hitler, pro-Soviet marches and demonstrations, and all of their newspapers and little magazines they put out were all suddenly pro-Hitler. And then, a year or so later, year and a half later, the Nazis invade Russia. And literally the next day, all of those groups and all of those magazines were anti-Hitler again, and he's a villain. And of course, it was all the proof you needed that these entities were controlled by the Soviets, because they didn't have any shame about being absolutely 100% against Hitler on Sunday, and then on Monday writing glowing articles about him, and then 2 weeks later, in this case a year and a half later, just suddenly turning on a dime and going back to writing scathing stories about how he's the devil again. So no consistency, no intellectual honesty, just always follow the party line. Well, we have seen that demonstrated in the last year or two by the entire mainstream media, in that when they're told, hey, it's the message is going to be that this is all a Russian conspiracy to overthrow the election and Donald Trump's in bed with the Russians, they just dutifully go about concocting stories, pulling threads out of sweaters, making mountains out of molehills, and then the moment a bunch of information that comes out that shows Hillary is a lot more connected, it was a Freudian slip, is a lot more connected to the Russians than Trump ever was. Literally, like the next day, Russians not that important, and that's just campaign oppo research. As if they are all taking orders from a calm intern and can turn on a dime. 180-degree tactics. They don't mean any of this stuff. It's not real. They don't believe it. They just say, oh, look, that's a hammer that I can use to beat against Trump. And the moment somebody tells them, hey, that hammer actually is used, by the Democrats. Oh, well, then they just put the hammer down and pretend I never touched that hammer. I wasn't using that hammer against Trump. It doesn't make any sense if you try to treat it as any kind of an honest intellectual endeavor. And that's just why there's no point in having a dialogue. And I've made this point again about how you're going to see people like Tom Hanks. I just saw him in an article in the New York Times a week or so ago. Nice Sunday profile of Tom Hanks. And he makes this point about how we're going through a dark time and how we need to listen to each other more and we need to understand each other. And then there was this article a few days ago that the former CEO of NPR had spent time going into Texas and the Midwest and hanging out with blue-collar whites and listening to their concerns, and how he's a bit ashamed that NPR hasn't given voice to these people and we need to spend more time listening to them. This is simply the fighter on his back in the middle of the fight saying, I just need, a couple seconds to get on my feet and get some water here. And then when you turn to go to your corner, he punches you in the back of the head. They're only telling you that they want a dialogue and, boy, we need to spend more time listening. And we've done just a terrible job in the past of featuring these voices. They're only saying all of that because they're losing right now, losing everywhere. The moment they have power again, the moment they start winning, you think they're going to give space in their magazines or on NPR to the voices of the Midwest or whoever they think they don't need anymore? They don't mean any of this. And so when they raise the flag of peace and when they start talking about how, gosh, everything's just become so violent and people aren't listening to each other anymore and it's breaking families apart, and we have to, that is the fringes signaling to the core that don't you want to go back to peaceful coexistence? They are responsible for all of this static. They are responsible for creating all of this discord. And the moment the discord isn't working for them, the moment we've joined it, and we're okay with a civil war, and we're basically like, bring it on, then they're immediately about, well, no, we need to listen to each other more and spend time talking over coffee. It's not sincere. I wish it were. I wish I could tell you that, we can get capitulation and surrender. They will never surrender. Anything that looks like surrender from them is simply a ploy. It is part of 180-degree tactics to get us to stop pressing so hard, to get us to loosen our grip. It's essentially an acknowledgement that we're winning, and they want us to ratchet it down so that they can get their footing again.
Seems like every day more information comes out about what the FBI knew and just disregarded. So, thanks to Jeff Sessions recusing himself when he shouldn't have, we're stuck with Mueller. He's the wrong sleuth when his ex-agency is so tangled up in Russia. Mr. Mueller has the means, motive, and opportunity to obfuscate and distract from matters embarrassing to the FBI. Instead, what does he focus on? Flimsy, disingenuous accusations that the Trump campaign colluded with the Kremlin. What a bunch of bull. The only saving grace out of all of this is we're finding out some of the stuff he probably doesn't want us to find out, and it's not about Trump.
But of course, any admiration and respect you might have had for the FBI is annihilated once you find out how easily they were used and co-opted for political purposes. We've talked in a previous podcast about how the intelligence agencies were completely co-opted and used. We have an administration, the past administration, the Obama administration, that actively eavesdropped on reporters domestically. They were eavesdropping on Americans en masse. They used this phony Russian dossier, which John McCain sent a staffer over to the UK to get a copy of and bring back so he could deliver it to the FBI. I mean, John McCain is knee-deep in all of this, okay? If it does turn out to be the Bushes that were responsible for funding this Oppo research originally, that's a nice Clinton-Bush connection, isn't it? Basically, that whole elite Chamber of Commerce, corporate cronyism, uniparty at the top, that may disagree about whose turn it is to be in power, but one thing they can all agree on is that we can't have somebody like Donald Trump get elected who would actually represent vast swaths of the American people, right? But unfortunately, and it goes to my point about how you cannot surrender with the left, there can be no meeting of the minds. There is nothing that they will not do. When they had possession of the intelligence agencies, they immediately used them as political tools. That dossier, to finish my thought, was used to get a FISA warrant on people, and then when that FISA warrant was catching Americans, the normal system of protecting their identity was completely obliterated, and there was massive unmasking, so that they essentially found a roundabout way of eavesdropping on the Trump campaign. They had found a way to wiretap the Trump campaign and then listen to it. That was what was going on, folks. That dossier was used to get a FISA warrant on people like Manafort, who they then wiretapped. And then, of course, all sorts of Trump people would have been involved in talking to Manafort on the phone, including Trump himself, which they have yet to admit. Wait till that explosive information comes out. And normally, because this is supposed to be a foreign warrant, they're only legally allowed to listen to the conversations that the subject is having with foreign agents or foreign citizens. And in the transcripts, all of the American citizens who are caught in this wiretapping their names are supposed to be blacked out. And then it's called unmasking. When a member of the intelligence group wants to know who that specific person was in the transcript, they have to file a formal request to have that person's name revealed. This wasn't just done a few times by people like Susan Rice and Samantha Powers. They were doing it by the hundreds. So what was clearly going on was that the wiretap was then all of these campaign people were unmasked, and it was essentially a way to listen in on the Trump campaign. That's not been fully admitted to yet, but that's what was going on. So the intelligence communities completely and entirely used for political operations, which means that their credibility is shot, and their powers, even if it makes us more vulnerable to terrorist attacks, their powers must be dramatically curtailed, because this is a red alert abuse of government power. Now we find out that the FBI was completely used as a political tool as well. The fix was always in on those investigations around her. No one's ever explained why two of the most prominent people on her staff were given immunity in that email investigation that led to no testimony against anybody else. They were just flat given immunity. That was a protection racket, plain and simple, because once they were given immunity, the two people probably most responsible were let off the hook. There'll be no charges. They used the IRS to go after the Tea Parties. So there you have it. The most powerful organizations in the country, the intelligence communities, the FBI, and the IRS, all used by the Obama administration to target their opponents. All politicized. If that had been done by a Republican administration, not only would the person have been impeached, but a number of cabinet members and staff members would have gone to jail, and the press would still not be done talking about it. There'd have been at least 10 Hollywood movies by now made from different people's perspectives about this Watergate on steroids politicization of all of these agencies of the government. And we would still not, there probably would be 2 or 3 television shows simply recounting it, like the OJ trial, and now they're doing Law and Order on the Menendez brothers. There would be one of these point by point, all the president's men type takedowns of how it all went down on television constantly. We would not be hearing the end of it. And frankly, that would all be legitimate, because whether it's a Republican or a Democrat, if somebody came into power in the White House and used the CIA, the FBI, and the IRS to systematically target their opponents, that should be a big deal. People should be going to jail. And the fact that that's not happening means it's going to happen again. I wrote a column on this once, and I'm going to make this point again, that when presidents take power, use powers, even if it's not constitutional, even if it's not legal, if they do it and they get away with it, that's the new norm. I'm just telling you, my reading of history for thousands of years is that if you don't actually stop the bad behavior when it happens and punish it, that becomes the new normal going forward. And it doesn't matter what the Constitution says, and it doesn't matter what's in the law books. It's a form of stare decisis, if you will. It is essentially pattern behavior. And you can always expect the other side's going to do that. This is not a Republican-Democrat thing in that sense. If one party does something and gets away with it, it's a tactic, and I don't care whether it's legal or not. If they get away with it, you can expect the other party's going to do the same thing when they can, because that's the new normal. It's like if one side in a warfare starts using a cannon, the other side's going to start building cannons. It doesn't matter if it's a horrific weapon. If then the other side comes up with machine guns that are tearing human bodies apart and nobody's ever seen that before, it doesn't matter. The other side's going to get machine guns. And then if one side starts using mustard gas and it's a horrific death for men in the trenches, and you think, gosh, there's no way this could become normal. Of course it will. The other side will immediately manufacture mustard gas, and that's what will happen. And then eventually, after World War I, the different parties came together and signed a treaty to not use it, and those chemicals were not used in World War II. But that was both sides agreeing in a treaty not to use those types of weapons. There's been there's nothing like that from the Democrats. No willingness by the left to punish their own, to say, look, we're going to make sure people go to jail and that this is punished because these weapons cannot be used. No, it's been made normal. So you can fully expect Republicans in the future to do the same thing at some point, because the Democrats certainly are. You think they get back in the White House, they're not going to go back to doing the same thing? They got away with it. And they had an attorney general who essentially ran interference and made sure no one was prosecuted. This is late Roman Republic stuff, folks. This is the entire fabric of your Constitution coming apart. It's like, I've been making the comment about it being Swiss cheese. And imagine that the Constitution is actually in some kind of a holder that stretches it. If you punch enough holes in that Constitution, eventually that stretching that it's in just rips it apart, because the fibers cannot hold it together again. I don't know exactly when that point is, but when you have intelligence agencies, the FBI, IRS running amok, and no one is held accountable, that is late stage stuff. You're being spied on. You have these tech giants who are in cahoots with the government, essentially turning over vast swaths of information about you. You don't have to be a conspiracy theorist to understand the reality of what is in front of you. This is all indisputable. I mean, it's true because the left, even though they poo-poo it and they only give it one story and then they move on, they still admit all this stuff. Everything I've just told you has been admitted by the newspapers and the media organs of the left. They don't dwell on it. They don't call for heads. They don't make a big deal out of it, but they admit that it's true. So the NFL continues to lose ratings. So this is good news. And I had another person in my life this week make basically a flippant comment that everyone will go back to watching the NFL in a few weeks, confirming once again what I discussed in a previous podcast, which is that there is this belief out there by the elites that you can't hold out, that you may protest the NFL for a short period of time, but that you can't live without these bread and circuses that are provided, and that you will come back. And I don't know whether that's true. I wanted to tell this person that was mocking me for the NFL boycott, I wanted to tell them that what they're saying isn't true and that people are going to send a strong message to the NFL, but I don't know. The jury's still out on this, and one of the big tests is going to be the Super Bowl. I can tell you I will not be watching the Super Bowl, and I'm not going to be attending a Super Bowl party. Now, I admit this is all much easier for me because I don't watch the NFL. And it's much tougher for folks like Doris who actually have a team they want to follow. But I'm usually I'm usually at a Super Bowl party and involved in that. So, that's definitely something that I'm going to be giving up. But this is not a big deal for me to give up the NFL. And I understand for a lot of other people out there that it is. But, you're being tested.
Advertisers spend millions of dollars on ads for the Super Bowl. And if the numbers are not good for the people watching it, those advertising prices are going to fall precipitously the next year.
They are. Speaking of holding out, I had promised in previous podcasts that I was going to be focusing on the House side of the GOP as far as targeting folks for defeat. I should say that I've been kicking around now for some time just blanket calling for every single incumbent to be challenged. I am not as hard on Paul Ryan as I know a lot of other people are. It's not like I'm a fan of the guy, but I really feel like the Senate is where the president has been stymied. The House has passed a number of key elements of Trump's agenda, and it is the Senate where these things have died. So my passionate hate right now is really focused on Senate Republicans and Mitch McConnell because they're the ones ultimately that I believe are holding this up. I get that Paul Ryan probably doesn't like Trump, but he's done, I think, a fairly good job of pivoting since the election and very seldom saying critical things of Trump, blowing off the media when they try to get him to be critical of Trump, and he has moved the agenda that Trump has asked for. Literally, I cannot think of anything that the president has asked for that hasn't been moved through the House in one form or another, other than that they didn't do as deep a budget cuts as he asked for. I don't think he expected them to do 30% budget cuts, and we are going to focus on some budget members eventually. When this final budget is passed, I'm going to take a look at the numbers, and I'm going to tell you who the Appropriations Committee chairs were who couldn't manage as Republicans to get deep cuts to the things that they supervised. They wouldn't cut into their own fiefdoms. We are going to examine that. But in general, I'm just not that mad at the House, and I am somewhat sad that if one of the houses of Congress flips in the next election, it's 99% likely to be the House of Representatives, not the Senate. I still don't think they're going to lose the House, but my point is that if one of the chambers were to fall to the Democrats, it would be the House, not the Senate. And it's sad to me that it's the Senate Republicans who have so infuriated voters, but most of them are not up for re-election, and therefore the anger has to be taken out on the House members who have, for the most part, done their jobs. Having said all that, I have identified 23 NeverTrump GOP congressmen and women who refused to endorse Trump in the election and who, well, let me give you that list first. So I'm just going to run down a list of folks. If this is anywhere within your state or nearby state or you can get involved in these campaigns, these folks need primaries and they need to be defeated for no other reason than to send a strong message that we expect support for Trump. Now, I have specifically not included people on this list who've already announced they're not running for re-election because as far as I'm concerned, they're already defeated. But here are people who do intend at this point to run for re-election and they need to be defeated in their primary. So you have Adam Kinzinger in Illinois, Richard Hanna in New York, Carlos Curbelo in Florida, Fred Upton in Michigan, Mike Kaufman in Colorado, Bruce Poliquin in Maine, Barbara Comstock in Virginia, Kay Granger in Texas, Mark Sanford in South Carolina, Reed Ribble in Wisconsin, Richard Hudson in North Carolina, Robert Dold in Illinois, and Scott Rigel in Virginia.
So that's two people each from Virginia and Illinois.
Right. I mean, there's some red states there where these people, it shouldn't be that tough to find a qualified candidate to oust them in their primary, and they need to go. I do realize that about half of these folks are in blue states, but chances are they come from a Republican district. And even if it's a swing district, I don't care. There's no reason why a Trump-supporting Republican can't win even in a close district. I just don't buy that. There's a lot of white Democrats specifically who will cross over and vote for a Republican who is a Trump nationalist, anti-open borders, and pro-revising our trade agreements Republican. You may not be getting the Chamber of Commerce's endorsement, but you're probably going to win that district. Now, a couple more names of folks who have made it clear that they support DACA. Okay, these are Republicans who are openly open borders folks. And that's Jeff Dunham in California, David Valadao in California, Carlos Curbelo again, repeating him from Florida, Mario Diaz-Balart in Florida, Daniel Donovan in New York, Don Bacon in Nebraska, Will Hurd in Texas, Martha McSally in Arizona, Dan Newhouse in Washington, and John Fazo in New York. Martha McSally in Arizona is maybe one of the people considering running for that open Jeff Flake seat. She absolutely cannot be the Republican candidate in the general election. So those of you in Arizona need to make damn sure that it's not Martha McSally. But those are the folks who are openly supportive of DACA and clearly then the most loyal to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce's open borders agenda, which makes them, whether they're going to admit it publicly or not, hostile Never-Trump Republicans. Not all of these people have been publicly criticizing the president since he got elected, but I guarantee you that all of them, when you hear about sources in the Republican Party saying bad things about the president, or a congressman who didn't want to be named told us X, and it's something negative about Trump, these are the people who are supplying those quotes, and they're the ones plotting against him. So if you heard the name of someone in your state or in a state nearby or a state where you have any influence, I hope that you will put your shoulder into making sure they don't return. We do need to turn over a fair number of House Republicans, and that was the first 23 that I was going to give you. Like I said, I'll be back, hopefully, in another podcast to give you a list of budget chairs who are conservative Republicans but couldn't manage to squeeze out cuts within their fiefdom. Because, that's the problem for these guys. They get on the Appropriations Committee and they have the Interior Department or whatever it is that they oversee. And if they cut it, if they reduce it, then they reduce their own influence, because these are the agencies that fear them and these are the agencies that have to do what they say. So the last thing they want to do is shrink them because that shrinks their own power. And it goes back to all the points I've made about the 17th Amendment and what happened when senators were no longer elected by the state legislatures. They were elected directly by the people. Then suddenly the growth of the federal government meant more power for them. And they didn't have any reason to care about state power because that's not who they had to be responsive to anymore. Same thing here with these budget chairs. They oversee certain aspects of the federal government, and they see that they're sort of little princes, little kings and queens of those departments. They have a lot of power because they control the purse strings, so those departments never want to piss them off and are constantly interested in what they're interested in, and yes-mens to them, yes ma'am, or yes sir. So it is difficult for them to cut. Of course, you wouldn't expect a Democrat to cut it all, but you would expect a Republican who's probably been running on that to do it, and we're going to follow up on that.
So did you hear about Amazon's Christmas present from President Trump? He signed this executive order that gives local areas leeway to test drones.
Oh, I did see this, that he's allowed this to go forward.
Right. It's the latest attempt to jumpstart an industry in which technology has moved at a rapid clip, only to be held back by regulatory and safety concerns. So there's still a lot of issues to work out. Safety, security remain for this unmanned industry, but it'll be interesting when the drone first delivers my package from Amazon to my front door.
Doris gets a lot of packages from Amazon, so we could hear the sound of drones constantly over the house. But I think it's interesting that he's done such a favor to Amazon. Amazon owned by Jeff Bezos, who owns the Washington Post, and the Trump's taken to calling the Post the Bezos Post or Amazon Bezos Post, and of course the Post is no friend of his, and Bezos has clearly set his minions to attack Trump constantly. But here is the administration doing something to assist Amazon in its effort to continue to dominate the retail market with its I mean, if it gets this whole drone issue solved and up and running, it's just going to further solidify them as a behemoth. You think Walmart was big. Amazon is on pace to become perhaps 10 times the size of Walmart as far as a corporate entity.
Well, last Christmas, 50% of all gifts given were bought on Amazon. I mean, that is huge. But, Trump, even though he should not be doing any favors for Amazon, he is able to look past petty indifferences and go ahead with what's good for the industry.
Certainly he's pro-business, and he's never been shy about that. I know the Weinstein thing continues to spiral out. Now all sorts of people being drawn in. Everyone who has some story sometime when they felt wronged is coming out of the woodworks out of the last 20 years, and it's just a free-for-all. It's it's just like a wildfire. But I was startled yesterday to see the former president George Herbert Walker Bush, 91-year-old and in a wheelchair, drug into this whole thing. Although I was startled by the details. So apparently, when people get a picture taken with him, he's not above placing his hand on the arse of the lovely young lady who is visiting.
Well, he can't reach any higher than that from a wheelchair.
But then, if you thought it was innocent, he apparently has this joke he likes to tell where he says, "You know who my favorite magician is? It's David Copperfield." Now, of course, I laughed hysterically when I heard that. But the actress from Turn was aghast that this had happened, and apparently took her weeks to recover with the help of her fellow castmates. And then some other woman has claimed that this also happened to her. I mean, I'm of two minds of this. It's kind of dirty old manish, and it's obviously inappropriate, but so in that way, I'm a little bit sympathetic to the women in this story. But the fact that you would be traumatized by this and it would take you 2 weeks or 3 weeks, and that you're even now still, I don't know if she's afraid to go outdoors or whatever as a result of this, but that seems to be, I guess I'm concerned about our resilience. Not to belittle this in any way, but people used to have their children die at young ages, and most people had to experience war at some point in their life in which people are killed. The world used to be a very violent place on a day-to-day basis for people. And up until antibiotics were created, death was fairly common, including instant death, child death. When I think about the kind of traumas that people have had to endure, that the human mind has learned to move past in order to get on with things over the last 10 millennium. And then I hear this story, of David Copperfield, and that this woman goes on and on about how she was essentially traumatized by this. I have real concerns about our resilience in this culture. If something really traumatic were to happen, an EMP attack, for instance, and the electricity grid is fried for a year and a half. First of all, a lot of people are going to die just because medicine and things can't get to them. But I'm concerned that even the healthy people who could grow a garden, or just do basic things to survive, just that they just don't have the resilience. I don't know any other way to put this. I am concerned that the resilience level in the average human being, especially the average American, is, if you think of a gas tank with 24 gallons, and maybe the Romans had 23, and the typical person throughout history had at least 20, I think that the average American has maybe 5 gallons in the tank of resilience. The ability to deal with something that's unpleasant or that is hurtful, that happens to all of us. And again, I'm not taking away from people's pain, but we have to be able to absorb negative things and to scale them, some 91-year-old former president placing his hand on your butt. It's not a good thing, okay? I'm not saying it's a good thing, but in the scale of terrible things that might happen to you in your life, that ought to be something that by, say, the next day, you can move past. If you're still having trouble dealing with that a couple months later, again, it's I'm focusing on this one instance, but I see it out there all the time. It doesn't even have to do with sexual harassment. I am just concerned about our ability as human beings to handle tough things or unpleasant things and be resilient. I'm concerned about younger generations and their ability to take body blows of one kind or another. And I read that story, and I know that the liberal commanding heights, the sort of conventional wisdom is that we're all just supposed to be aghast at that, and it's just another patriarchal example of how women are oppressed. But while I suppose in some small way it is, it's also a story about a complete lack of resilience. And I just think that as in that particular case, that's the bigger story. And again, some of the stuff that came out about Harvey Weinstein is pretty gross, and I'm wondering why people didn't press the issue at the time. And then you have some of these folks who signed non-disclosure agreements, and now they want to come out and tell stories. But I'm asking myself, yeah, but when $1 million or something was dangled in front of you, you were more than happy to take that money and sign the contract. So there are a lot of stories that aren't getting told in all of this. And it's perfectly fine to me that women want to tell these stories and want to address these issues of men behaving badly. I'm no saint, and I'm sure, that is an issue that needs to be addressed. But, this is a multifaceted diamond, this subject, because, one of the things that's clear in the subtext when you read these stories about Harvey Weinstein is that there were a lot of women who didn't say no. And there are clearly a lot of women who got parts and got advanced in the industry and have careers and are now wealthy as a result of playing that game that was going on. I don't know, Doris, what do you think about all of that?
Well, let's see. From a woman's point of view, I think that rape, inappropriate touching with sexual intent is something that should be acknowledged, punished, corrected, so forth. But this word inappropriate touching has become this very broad definition, which doesn't include just with sexual intent. And I just think it's crazy. I recently wrote a letter to the editor of our newspaper telling him that we need to get a little real on this stuff. Matt's right, talking about resilience, and maybe we should really think about how we could ruin someone's reputation when making accusations that really don't amount to anything. Because it seems like people today take those accusations and automatically assume guilt. And it's wrong. And I think the feminist movement has moved in the wrong direction in a lot of things. It used to be that a woman appreciated a guy opening a car door for her. But now, if a guy opens a car door for a lady, he doesn't know if he's going to get a dirty look or if he'll get a thank you. I think it's really tough out there being a guy these days.
Well, I think the problem with these kinds of eruptions, when an issue becomes sort of a cause celeb, when something sort of becomes a brush fire, is there are some legitimate grievances that have to be dealt with. And there are women telling stories about Harvey Weinstein and some women telling stories about others that, that stuff needs to be addressed. Absolutely. I hear, again, I'm baffled why, it baffles me that Harvey was able to do that for 20, 30 years. And that it was so widely known, and that, no one was essentially willing to confront him about this. And it's clear that many organs of the press knew these stories, and they weren't telling them. He's only now being taken down when he essentially has no power, and the company was on the rocks anyway. But I guess, my concern is that when these brush fires get started, they tend to burn the whole forest. And you will, as Doris said, you're going to get a lot of people who, in the course of a week, if 20 people are accused, it's all just going to go on Google and everyone's going to move on. And maybe 18 of those are true and 2 of those people were falsely accused. No one's going to care. They're just going to get lumped in with the accusations that were made, and they're going to get run over. And I have been watching for the last few years the ability of the internet to unperson people. And I am very concerned about that we live in a society now where on a regular basis people are unpersoned. And most of us don't even recognize it.
What is that?
So you will be following some story and you'll hear that someone, I guess I'll use real examples. So there was this gal who was she worked for a news outlet, and she was young gal, she was flying to Africa. She made some AIDS-related joke about catching AIDS or something, and then got on the plane, and she didn't have any internet service for the next 12 hours or whatever she was flying to Africa. And her tweet or whatever it was blew up and was shared tens of thousands of times, and people were going crazy nuts, unhappy about it. And again, I'm not defending the tweet. It was obviously a stupid thing for her to do. But by the time she landed, she'd been fired, and she'd been made into a pariah. Now, she is a classic example of this unpersoning, because what happens is that her life is severely damaged, and now she probably will have real trouble finding employment. But the mob just moves on. No one even thinks about her 5 days later. But suddenly she's left essentially stripped, bankrupted, and marooned. And the crowd just moves on. It's like a person's been kicked out of the vehicle in the middle of the Mojave Desert. And everybody goes back to singing camp songs, and no one thinks about that person anymore. And every few days I see this, again, it can be an off-color remark or something that somebody says, and they lose their job, and they lose their status in society, what have you, and then, there's no one ever follows up. And, it used to be that if you did something wrong, say, in the 1960s, you did something wrong, you might very well lose your job, and you might be ostracized, and the newspaper would do a story, but then that goes on microfiche at the library. Somebody has to make a real effort to find that about you. So you could move to another state, and you could try to make, you could do your time if you had to do jail time or whatever, and you could make amends, and you could move somewhere else, and you could start a new life. But the internet, what the internet means, and this is what people have been trying to explain to young children who, teenagers who are putting so much stuff out on social media, is that stuff lives forever. What you type when you're 18 will still be fresh and sitting there when you're 41. And so when people make mistakes, when they do bad things, and I'm not suggesting they shouldn't be punished, but now the way our internet works, they're frozen forever. Whatever their crime, whatever their transgression, whatever the mean thing was that they said or inappropriate thing that they did, it's yesterday forever. It never gets to be a year ago or 10 years ago or 20 years ago. It is always yesterday forever, because you type in their name, and like that, all that information about what they did 16 years ago is sitting there as if it happened yesterday. And there are thousands of people out there who have fallen into this unperson hole. And again, I want to be clear, I'm not defending whatever it was that they did at the time that got them in trouble or got them ostracized, but they're never allowed off their knees, ever, because of the way the internet works. And anytime they go to apply for a job, routinely HR departments run Google searches on people, and then bingo, up stuff that it's as if it happened yesterday, and it's over. The job application is over. And there are a lot of men, it's much more men than women, but there are certainly women. I mean, think of this lawyer at CBS, the one who made the comment about Trump supporters deserving it in the Vegas shooting. Not defending that, really stupid thing to say. She absolutely should have been fired by CBS, but what she typed will be yesterday for her forever. Yeah. Forever.
She's done in that industry for sure.
So, the exemptions to this are people like Bill O'Reilly, right? He's got these sexual harassment allegations, and he loses his job, and he doesn't get to be famous and influential anymore, but they paid him $25 million, and, he's not going to be begging for crumbs on the streets. He's got a yacht, and he may be nursing a grudge, but I'd rather be nursing a grudge with $50 million or $100 million than just nursing a grudge. So, when you see this happen to really wealthy people or people who have means, again, it's not a good thing, but they have money to cushion the blow. But a lot of these people who are just working folks, or a reporter who does something wrong, or a lawyer or whatever, they're not necessarily wealthy, and they may end up exhausting whatever money they have to defend themselves in the midst of whatever it is that they've done wrong at the time. So they're not going to have much money when that's all over. But then they're permanently unpersoned, and everyone just moves on. And it's been happening now for about 20 years, and there are literally thousands of people out there that you could do this whatever happened to bit. And I have seen some articles that have gone back and found some of these people, and life isn't very good. Life isn't very good. So again, I'm a little bit off topic on what we started on, but it does bother me that these brush fires now are much more lethal than they were decades ago.
I mean, even lethal are these spurious jealousy type comments that teenage girls put up on the internet against one of their fellow students that they don't like. And we've even seen instances of suicide over that. It's just crazy. So be careful what you post in social media.
Well, and I think as a society, too, we have to address this idea of how long does a person sit in the doghouse? Again, we don't have to condone the behavior, the actual criminal activity, or the tweet or the social media post that may have been abominable. But, who wants, it's easy just to say, well, they deserve it, but to have them go decade after decade as if that just happened yesterday is pretty severe. It's pretty severe. And I don't know how you expect people to live, really, in the long term with that. There was a Black Mirror episode. Black Mirror is kind of it's this British show. It's a little bit like the Twilight Zone. Each one's a standalone episode, and they tend to deal with, I definitely recommend the show, but it is disturbing, folks, so be warned. But every episode tends to deal with, the idea of some future technology in the not too distant future, and then the sort of pros and cons of that. And there was one episode where it turns out that it's not really revealed until the end of the episode, but what is going on is they have this future technology to force a criminal to relive their crime every day. So they're sort of locked in this coma where they're forced to live in their worst moment for like eternity. And it's horrific to think about. I mean, and again, if you told me you were going to put somebody in that and they were going to have to relive it for like 10 years, that's debatable as a form of punishment. But like forever? I don't think people really, and if you watch the episode, and it's horrific, but it's challenging. And I think we have a version of this in our society where the internet does not let people achieve any level of forgiveness or allow them an opportunity to rebuild. Doris and I saw Only the Brave this week, which is the story of the Granite Mountain Hotshot team. True story, 19 of the 20 who died in a forest fire, brush fire. It stars Josh Brolin and Jeff Bridges and Jennifer Connelly and Miles Teller. Everyone does a really good job in this. First of all, the story is really about them and who they were and their job. The tragic event doesn't happen till the very end. And it's a loving tribute. It was just a nice, sweet look at men being men and doing manly things. These guys are firefighters, and they have a brotherhood that forms, and they protect, and they serve their community. And this thing is very physically and mentally challenging, and they rise to that challenge, and they hold each other accountable, and they're dignified, and the movie was dignified, and it was just a really wonderful portrait. It's definitely something that I recommend for the whole family. It's not the kind of, it's a rare treat in the cinema right now of just a very wholesome movie that celebrates our humanity, and it's a rare movie out there right now that celebrates men and masculinity.
Yes, that's very true. And the part I liked, that there were no political overtones at all. It was just it's a heartwarming story about real heroes. And I really liked it. I would give it an A or an A minus.
No, I totally agree. I absolutely agree. And I think if you're looking for a nice treat at the cinema, it's not a particularly sad movie. Like I said, the tragedy happens at the very end, and that's obviously moving. But most of the movie is just a celebration of life and of them, and like I said, and what they do for a living and who they were as people. And it's not going to win an Oscar, but it's just a nice treat. And like I said, you're just not going to see a lot of movies right now that celebrate men being men, and this movie does that. And it's, you're not going to be looking at your watch. It's very involving, and the characters are all very well drawn. You just kind of feel like you knew a lot of these guys. There are some action sequences in it around the fire, and it's just a very involving story. So Doris and I both recommend it. We're just about out of time, but you can find this episode and past episodes on iTunes and SoundCloud, Stitcher, and Pocket Cast. I'm hoping you'll share this podcast with one other friend. Just one other friend, that's all we ask. This is a labor of love, but we need to grow. Trump supporters, you are not alone. Goodbye, Doris.
Goodbye, Matt.